That concludes the second session today. A bit as the first session, perhaps just a couple of points of reflection before we open out for a Q&A. And all those who presented today who are still around are here in the front rows, so they can ask any further questions, so we can range a bit widely if it helps. A couple of takeouts for me. One, I think this afternoon has demonstrated, in case you were in any doubt, that there are significant changes taking place. We're certainly not done, but the sort of difference between where we were in sort of March, April time, brackets, the last time we were about to have a Brexit deal deadline, and now has been enormous. That has coincided, of course, with a change of leader of the Conservative Party and therefore cabinet. Government activity has meant that the kind of rate of legislation, guidance, engagement, etc., has increased, but with a very clear and specific purpose, which is getting the UK ready for Brexit. And of course, and I don't take this in any sort of way flatteringly, but government has been telling us all to prepare for no deal, because just like we have for 3 years, if you're ready for that, you're ready for as much as you can be. At the same time, we don't know everything, but what we do know, and I think is very clear, is that we'll have, I think, first of all, some temporary measures in place, some delays on some decisions. So we're a bit clearer about processes, certainly at frontiers, how traffic will be managed, easements and other temporary arrangements, what the flow of goods is designed to look like. But we don't know everything. I'm personally relieved to an extent to see that HMRC or understand that HMRC will be prioritising traffic flow rather than administration. But as we heard earlier, there is lots of detail missing. I had a couple of comments after our colleague from HMRC had left to say, it's all very well pointing us to lots of guidance and there being kind of 40 bits rather than 100 bits, but there are still gaps. Some of them don't fit together, as they've said themselves. It's far from clear. And I think what I would say is, look, the WSTA's job is to try and help with that. Individual businesses are not going to get answers out of HMRC when HMRC don't yet have a clear steer from government about policy, let alone how to enforce it, which is, of course, what they will need to do. One follows the other. At the same time, that does not mean we should simply sit back. We at the WSTA we're very careful about our relationship with HMRC, but we have earned, I hope, the right to ask them some difficult questions on your behalves. So we don't wish to take on, the weight of the world, but we definitely want to take on your questions. If you are not satisfied that you have answers, if you are not satisfied that there is guidance covering things that you're still worried about, of course, there are degrees of answer. We don't know the answer to this yet, but it'll be coming is better than, we haven't thought about that. Our aim is to try and make sure that we bottom out the questions and then we make sure we get answers from HMRC. So if you are not satisfied, please let us know. We will endeavour to get some of the answers we don't yet have out of HMRC. I can't guarantee we will be successful, but I can guarantee that we will try our very best. Moving on a little bit, David gave me a couple of words that might be useful for summing up this session. David's fond of a good quote, and I like this one. He said he hopes that someone has told Border Force about Mike Tyson's advice, which is that everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. It's succinct and to the point. But I think, we are entirely untested at the moment. We hope that we will not be in a position of no deal, but we don't know what position we will be in, and best laid plans and all. Very interesting to hear, from Duncan. Hauliers are certainly, facing a pretty daunting prospect. I think they're lucky to have the RHA helping them. It's very clear that there is a lot to do. They're going to be entirely reliant on exporters to get the formalities right. They'll want to transfer any risks they can and back up their preparations with the rest of the supply chain. We know that transport is virtually all booked up for the foreseeable future. People are stockpiling, this industry in particular, at this time of year. The negative consequences of having vehicles and drivers stuck in traffic jams are so obvious, I won't mention it. We've heard about queues on the M20, etc., but those are the most obvious ones. Security risks for high-value loads are also pretty obvious. That's security, again, quite basic, and that's before we get to documents. The demands that are likely to be placed on, in some cases, drivers, for example, who may well be on their own, whose job is to drive long distances, and suddenly they have this admin to deal with, and particularly changing situations. That looks difficult. Finally, Bex's session covered a little bit, particularly around kind of labelling and certification and what we know so far. We've had some success with VI1s, but it's all relative. It's all about things being less bad than they might be. Therefore, it's hard to be entirely reassuring, but what we're trying to be is clear, including where we don't have the answers. We do know that products on the UK market, whilst things will change, there'll be temporary transition periods. We will endeavour to make sure those are certainly at least as long as they've been suggested for the moment. Some are in any event longer than others. What we need to do is start proposing solutions for the end of those transition periods. We will do our best. Any ideas you have are welcome. Any questions you have will help us think that through. A point that came up earlier today, what we cannot guarantee, and it came up from the floor, is how 27 other member states of the European Union will behave towards the UK. Now, we're in contact with European colleagues. I don't think there's any intention to do anything nefarious, but the fact is things will change and it will become more complicated. So, while it's not a rosy picture, we hope that there's at least some clarity on some of the things that are changing. I think if we do reflect on how far some of this has come since, say, March, April, I think that's a great deal more progress than was made in the 2.5 years prior to that. We are absolutely not there yet. We hope we're never in a position where we're talking about no deal, but we can't afford to be complacent, and therefore we must continue to prepare. I'd like to get over to questions now. Just a reminder, if you have questions that you ask now and we haven't got answers, or you don't hear answers that help, or indeed you think of a question afterwards, keep them. We're going to be stockpiling questions while you stockpile products, and we will attempt to give you answers, if not necessarily by Christmas, but we'll see what we can do. So, questions. I think we can range pretty widely. Any from this afternoon, any gripes, concerns. We've got one hand up just over there. Kelly, coming to you now. Again, if you could just tell us your name and where you're from, and then fire away. Yeah,
it's David from Inotri & Co. Just on labelling, exporting spirits to the EU, will they also be required to have an EU importer label or EU food business operator?
Okay, short and sweet. We'll come back to that in a second. If I can try and do the same again, take a couple of questions. Yes, one at the front on the left here.
Thanks. Mike Bentley from Jigsaw Drinks. It sounds like one of the big concerns is when the drivers rock up at the winery in Europe and they're bringing wine back to the UK. Will that driver have a checklist of the paperwork that is needed to move that wine? Or who will have that definitive list of the paperwork needed? So the driver isn't struggling, the winery isn't struggling. How do we cover that off?
Good question. I'm looking towards Duncan for that one. We'll come back. One more so we can make it a nice round three. Good Lord, no. None. Right. Oh, no, we have. We've got a third. Thank you.
Isabel Clark from Clark Foyster Wines. We've heard quite a lot about TSP again this afternoon. This morning, the message was that if you're taking wine into a bonded warehouse, TSP is not actually relevant. Can somebody clarify that for us?
Okay, great. All right. 3 quick questions there. Bex, do you want to just take the microphone? If you could just maybe just stand up and spin around so everyone can see, and Duncan, come on over. Thank you.
Yes, so spirits being sent to the EU, you will have to have an EU import address. The reason that I mentioned wine rules specifically is because they're slightly different than for spirits. So wine is covered by the wine regs, whereas spirits covered by the EU food regs. So you'll have to have an FBO importer address on the label, which is the responsible food business operator. I've got my thing falling on the floor. So you'll have to have that on the label as well. So from day one, no deal, you'll have to have an EU address on the label who's responsible importer. And I suppose the importer, if you're not already aware, probably defined as the person who's moving the goods over the customs border. So it's a conversation to have with whoever's importing your goods.
Thank you, Bex. Duncan, drivers and checklists.
Drivers, actually, it's a really good question. You can't rely on a driver to know what paperwork is needed. The driver personally it's like asking a bus driver to know the names of the passenger on their bus. They turn up, they get given stuff, they don't actually know the actual implications of it. It's between the trader and the logistics company who's actually commissioning the driver to make sure that the driver is given the right paperwork. The other thing that you need to bear in mind is that you may be there, you may be picking up a part load. A full load is one thing. A part load going via somewhere else, which goes somewhere else, again, it starts getting complicated because the driver that's actually collecting the goods may not be the driver that goes over the border. So it's absolutely critical that the exporter and the importer know who the logistics company and who's actually in control of that freight, and don't rely on the driver personally as an individual. Rely on the organisation behind the driver, and it's that logistics company that needs to have their game right, and they need that paperwork because that truck is going to get stuck in Calais. It's going to get stuck in Cannes. It's going to get stuck somewhere if the paperwork is not right. So don't assume that the exporter is going to give the right paperwork to a driver and the driver's going to know he's got not got enough. The logistics company, you're going to need to make sure that the head office knows what's going on.
Okay. Do you want to just hand to Rob for one quick addition? And
Just
David.
something additionally on that, the EU market access database, once the UK becomes a third country, should actually appear within that market access database. So if you're exporting from the EU to the UK, provided the information is there for the EU to access and to update their market access database, your French winery should be able to find out all of the documentation, etc., using that database for what's needed to export to the UK, including all of those documents. Can we just jump on one question that came in via Twitter as well, which is just very simple. Where do fortified wines sit? Are they classified as wines or spirits? They sit under 2204, so they're classified as wines in the tariff codings. Thanks.
Thank you. Look at that, we're interactive.
And within the Excise Structures Directive, they're liqueur wines. So they can... How many labels do you want? The TSP point, I actually have ended up today foggier than I was this morning on TSP. If you go back to what the customs guidance says on TSP for controlled goods, first of all, you put in a simplified declaration, which you then update when the goods arrive. Then you put in a full supplementary declaration by the 4th working day of the following month. So far, so good. This is where it gets tricky. It then says it will use your deferment account, which you must have, to take duties on the 29th day of the following month from you putting in your supplementary declaration. Now, the only duty that it's going to take is excise duty, because we've already established that there isn't any customs duty because it's 0 on the tariff. So that seems to imply that it's automatically going to take excise duty, which means that if you want to put your goods into an excise warehouse for longer than the 29th day of the month following the day you put in your supplementary declaration, then you're going to have to pay that duty effectively up front before you've sold it on to somebody. So if you wanted to put it into an excise suspensive regime for 2 months or 3 months or 25 years, in the case of some businesses, then you would need to use a different mechanism to get it across the border, either CFSP, Customs Simplified Freight Procedures, or a full customs declaration. So it's not saying it can't have it, it's just TSP might not be the appropriate measure for each transaction for each business, and it depends what a particular business is trying to achieve at the time. I think this is something we're going to have to take back to HMRC and clarify, because I'm not convinced that their own guidance is clear enough, and I think they might have thought about excise traders and thought about fast turnover tobacco, fast turnover beer and wine, but not necessarily thought about some of the other products that go through. So I think the jury's a bit out on TSP, and it's something we're very much going to have to go back to them on.
Thank you, David. I wish that were a shorter and clearer answer, but I don't think that's anything to do with David. Thank you. Further questions?
Hi. We often have EU suppliers send us
Sorry, could you just say who you are?
Oh, sorry. Laura Hardy from Freshnett Copestick again. We often have samples sent to us from EU suppliers who would normally raise an EAD, which is closed by the likes of Hillebrand for us. How would they send samples to us in the future in the event of a no deal?
Good question. Any more? Yes, I can see Charles and Nick at the back. I don't know why the people I know are at the back row, but there we are.
Hello, it's Nick Groom, previously from Waitrose. I've heard a lot about the supply of haulage drivers, particularly in the UK, and just wondering what the industry is doing about addressing the shortage. There appears to be more medium term, really, than short term. And how much other forms of transport can help in that situation, such as rail and those sort of intermodal movements.
Thank you. One for Duncan, I think we'll come back to. One more. Charles.
As far as import duties are concerned, is it going to be possible to pay them without having a deferment account? So you just pay them straight through?
Thank you, Charles, from Distillers. Right. 3 questions there. Who wants to go first? David, number 1.
Samples and
samples.
Samples, yes. At the moment, samples should come under the EMCS, although I suspect in some cases they might not. There's no exception. It should be an export declaration and an import declaration. They won't need a VI1 because they'll be under 100 litres, so that's at least a relief. But they should actually go through the same system as any other commercial consignment. So far as deferment for import duties are concerned, do you know what? I've never actually looked at that, so I shall have to check that.
Yet another thing to come back on later. You asked about drivers, what the industry is doing. The industry has been stepping up its training of drivers and pushing the apprenticeship scheme. the industry itself has a long tail of very small businesses that do find it difficult to engage in training. It's something that we as a trade association and other trade associations are doing significant work on to improve the training. But one of the things we also have to do is we also have to ensure that our members treat their drivers better, that we look at more flexible working practices. There's a whole range of things. The fact that the UK is leaving the EU doesn't change that situation at all. We have the problem whether we're in the EU or not in the EU. It's not Brexit related. It's something that our industry needs to get a grip of and deal with itself. But there are many, many industries that are also facing the same sort of problems in terms of the status of people doing work and the feeling of respect that they have in the work that they do. It's a real problem with drivers, and it's something that many industries are dealing with. I think it's partially cultural. You asked about modal shift and rail and what have you. Rail's very good at what rail does. We have no problem with using rail. We don't see rail being part of the Brexit mix either. Rail for domestic transport will be used, particularly from the centre of England up to Scotland. It's already heavily used. We expect that to continue. We don't expect any change coming from Brexit. And there was another question after that. I'm not sure what it was.
There was. I think David's got that one. It's Charles's.
I'm just going to come back on that, Charles. Yes, you can defer customs duty. It's Notice 101, but nothing's simple in this world in that it's got a different accounting and payment period to deferring excise duty.
Great, thank you. More questions? Any more for any more? Very good. Miles. It's great to be able to say. Invite Miles to speak and be quiet.
Yeah, thanks, Miles. Miles from Jascott's here. Could you give us what your thoughts are on the implications on the timing of the November budget in the various Brexit, no deal scenarios?
Yes, in a moment. There was one other hand up, yes.
Yes, it was me. I'm Gabby from Barry Bodison Rudd. My question would be, what are the delays we are expecting now in Dover? So do we, in a no-deal scenario, do we need to add on 2 days, 3 days, a week? I don't know. And are there any delays expected in UK ports?
Okay. One more?
Yep. Mike Bishop from Casella Family Brands. We sell into Europe through a network of distributors who purchase from us on an ex-works basis, ex-works UK. Who is the importer?
Okay. David, do you want to take that last one first from Mike?
Okay, I think there's a couple of possible answers there. The first question is, who do you want it to be? Because that's something that in theory is open to some degree of discussion with your business partners in Europe. The second issue is, remember, because it's wine as opposed to spirits, the wine regs define the importer as the person who's clearing it into free circulation. So if you have 23 different people clearing it into free circulation within the EU, that's 23 different importers, which means 23 different labels. So it's the same issue that a number of people in the UK have when they're supplying more than one supermarket, for example. It probably makes sense to decide on one person who's going to be the importer, and they're the person who then clear it into free circulation.
Thank you. Duncan, do you want to come back on Gabby's point?
I'll comment on Dover. I'll leave the budget to you to comment about. Dover, it's very difficult to give an assessment of what the delays through the Dover Straits are going to be. What I would say is, if you ensure that your paperwork and you're on a lorry with correct paperwork, I would not expect huge delays. A day, 2 days should be about it. But we're dealing with unpredictable circumstances. Ferry companies may cut down the number of sailings. They may actually effectively just allow things into the EU through Calais, to stop queues. There's a load of things that we just do not know how people are going to behave. So what I would suggest is be prepared for a couple of extra days, and well, if it's longer than that, you're just going to have to wear it.
Good, thank you. That was a straight answer to a straight question. Miles, on the budget, I mean, a couple of things. On when, I mean, yes, probably slightly surprised when a 6th of November date was announced. I can see from the government's point of view that it's nice to have that in the diary as something where they get a chance to speak from a government platform, so they'd have been tempted to schedule something, whatever happens. I mean, you know, your guess is as good as mine as to whether it goes ahead or not. I think, you know, what I would say is if we get a deal passed through the House of Commons, the government has said it wants a general election, and the question is, you know, how soon would it pursue one, and would other opposition parties be happy to offer one? From Boris Johnson's point of view, he may well want to do a deal, have a rather attractive budget announcement, and then go straight into an election, because it would all help with his messaging, which is exactly why some of the opposition parties might not want it to happen, but they may not be able to prevent it. If there isn't a deal, or it doesn't get through the House of Commons, I think we'll have to see what happens next. I think if particularly Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, whose position is rarely clear, yeah, I think I'll stop there. Clearly what they have said is they would like a general election, but they're now, again, like a very heavy, long, slow turning oil tanker. Possibly their position is moving to one where they don't want a general election until the spring, in which case, you know, that would leave time for a budget. So I think it all really hinges on what happens tomorrow, and probably not worth speculating further. What I would say is this, you know, we've just had a conversation, and attached to almost every solid bit of information, there is probably a pound sign. Any of those who are, you know, wine is 99% imported, any of those who have anything to do with wine know full well that the only impact we have already seen from Brexit that's clear is on the pound, so things are becoming more expensive. We are trying to sum all of this up in language that the government understands, and whether you look at it from a trade point of view, a UK domestic consumption point of view, our message to government is, and I've seen a couple of ministers this week, the message is make the UK market more attractive, because duty, excise duty, is the one thing that is entirely within the gift of government. UK excise duty rates are very high, both in universal absolute terms, but also relative ones. So the two stats we always give to ministers is, an extraordinary 67% of all excise duty paid on wine across 28 member states is paid by British consumers to the UK Treasury. For spirits, it's 77% of an average price bottle of spirits is tax. This is ludicrous. We have, the UK drinks industry is the #1 drinks industry in the world, in many respects, completely clearly. We won't continue to hold that position unless we're given some support as a sector. So if you haven't got involved with some of our campaigning, please do. We will be asking for a cut from government. I think it's especially important for wine, because last year it was singled out for a duty increase, and we now know that that's had an impact in the market. Sales are down, excise duty receipts are also down. Wine's now had a 12% increase since 2014. If you compare that to beer, beer has had, in fact, a cut of 0.2%. But the point is that's not fair, and we think it ought to be redressed. It's important that it does, or this industry will not be able to respond well to Brexit. So forgive me for using this as a soapbox, but I think worth it. Please do get in touch if you want to know more. Further questions? We've got time for a couple more, and then we have something refreshing and probably a bit stronger. Okay, I'm going to take that as a... Have we got... Sorry, did we have one more? We had... I'm sorry.
Hello, this is Richard Jones of Ray Kinderman. It's a question about lower and zero alcohol wines. What protocol will it differ from standard still wines? We are aware that obviously a VI1 document isn't required, but things like labelling and who will be the importer, does it differ from wine?
Any others while we're... Yep, one more to collect, just behind you, Freddie, just there.
Hi, it's Claudia from Firewood again. This is a question about the export declaration and import declaration. Is it feasible to think about a scenario where if my producer acts as an exporter and I'm the importer, the goods can, when you talk about, having some sort of warehouse or facility close to a port, is it possible to use any of the facilities that the hauliers already have? Can the hauliers play any part in the transaction where my goods are waiting to cross the border, even if they're not necessarily, of course, the exporter or importers?
Okay. One more? No? Going? Okay. David. Well, Bex is going to be up first. Thank you.
So on low and no, good question. So post-Brexit, low and no, if it's under 8%, isn't classed as a wine. So it'll be covered by the food rules. So you definitely won't need a VI1 in any situation. The other thing to remember on low and no as well is that the rules for how you're able to label low and no are not in legislation. It's general government guidance. So the UK government has guidance on low and no, which is why you can sell a German beer, for example, in the UK with 0.5% and call it a low alcohol beer. But you would normally not be able to market that on the UK market. If you're from the UK, you'd have 0.05%. So that's slightly different. But there's some guidance on the UK government website. We'd obviously suggest following the UK guidance. But that is why there's some discrepancies in the UK over those. Didn't want to use beer as an example. Apologies.
It's allowed. David.
Yeah, I mean, Duncan may well have a view on the role of hauliers. I think the point is, if you've got goods that are moving from a producer to a point of export, where there's an EMCS movement that will need to be closed off, the goods will need to be physically somewhere. The movement under EMCS can only be closed off in an excise warehouse. And then presumably that warehouse keeper will be the next person who generates the export documentation to get it out, or if there's a customs agent who generates it, that will then result in an instruction to the warehouse keeper. So I guess it depends on the extent to which hauliers and warehouse keepers are integrated in that particular supply chain, whether they're part of the same company or whether they're different companies simply acting under contracts with each other. And that might be a question that importers and exporters ask of their third-party logistic partners. How integrated are you? Is it going into your warehouse that you can control, or are you just a third-party haulier and you're taking it to another third-party warehouse? So there may well be a role, but it's going to depend very much on the structure of individual businesses, I think. But Duncan may well have a different perspective on it.
Duncan has nothing to add. Good. Great. Before I wind up, any last questions? We're about bang on time. Oh, we have got one more. We've got time. Just in the middle on the left there, Freddie. Thank you.
It's Christine from Broadland Wineries. As a follow-up to that last question, will the producers in Europe not be able to consign to the port of export, to the last office of control? Because we do that in the UK for exports to third countries?
Okay, that's a question I can't answer. David, do your best.
This is single transport contracts, isn't it? Yeah. single transport contracts, I think, will still exist, so they should be able to do it. Whether that works for a lot of the products coming out of EU in terms of being groupage loads from numbers of different small producers, I don't know. Again, it's going to depend on the individual supply chain. So yeah, people may well be able to still do a single transport contract as an option, which is why we're saying it's really important that people talk to their business partners and understand exactly who's going to do what in the process.
Okay. Any more for any more? No. Okay. Look, I think all that remains is for me to sum up very briefly. I think if I may take a liberty and say, here's what I would like you to do if you've been in the audience today. Number one is, first and foremost, keep an eye on the news this weekend. That would be some advice. Might help you do a bit of planning. Number two is don't panic. Whatever happens this weekend, please don't panic. For all of the fury and language and bluster and concern, governments are not in the habit of trying to make life more uncomfortable for their citizens and their businesses, directly. Now, indirectly, I can't speak for them, but they're very, very clear that we don't want no deal. I think Parliament has acted on this. So wherever we get to on Saturday, I don't immediately think we're suddenly looking at no deal. But I also don't think it's ruled out. So number three is stay in touch. Please stay in touch with us. Maybe leave your business cards at the sort of reception desk that you came in so that we're in touch. Yes, if you're not members, we'd like you to become members. But you've been here today, so you have something to contribute, and we want to bring together all the questions that are available. I mean, I certainly have a list of things to come back on. There's some elements to come back to HMRC with. David's picked up a couple. Sometimes they're because we know they need to work them out. Sometimes we're not sure they've got it quite right. They do need us. David, as a former HMRC employee, is in a good place. He speaks fluent HMRCese and occasionally is influential. We've got something on samples. I think we've got something on organics. We've got quite a lot in relation to kind of how things will work in practice. I've got something I'll follow up with Duncan about, real-time information. Once we get to whatever sort of exit we're getting to and whatever deadline passes, and it may be on the 31st of October, 1st of November, but equally it might be the 1st of January 2021, or indeed later. I think we all will need to know what things look like, and we'll have to adapt accordingly. So please, feedback from you, questions from you, business cards from you, further thoughts from you. What we will do for you, we have filmed, we will turn that into something as digestible as possible and get it back round to you. You have the presentations from today already. We will collate the questions. The aim will be to produce some sort of FAQs, and if they're not frequently asked questions, maybe they're just AQs, but what we'll do is try and gather them together, and we will tell you what answers we think we have. We will update them as and when. We will also tell you when we don't have the answers and what we think is happening about them. HMRC don't know, and we're going to try and find out. May have to be an acceptable answer, but I hope you'll understand why. And of course, the last thing that we will do, and we will do to the very best of our ability, is seek to put your collective view to ministers, whoever they are, whenever it's required, to get the best possible outcome for this industry. So please remain in touch, tell us what we can do for you, but also, as I've said before, the flow of information works both ways. We are only as good as the information we have. If we don't know you're worried, we won't know to hold anyone's feet to the fire. So please keep us in touch, and we'll see what we can do. Last thing is for me to ask you to thank our guests, including particularly Duncan, who stayed, but also members of the WSTA team. I can recommend them all very highly. They are all likened to a particular refreshing drink on our website, so do take a look. And they all have an area of expertise, whether it's sort of HMRC-E's in David's case, or trade policy in Rob's, or labelling and Brexit generally in Bex's case, which is a pretty tough ask. We're here to help. Please stay in touch, consider them friends, and we will see what we can do for you. So thank you very much, particularly to Bex. Thank you.